Welcome back to Read Aloud. We are doing chapter 18 of The Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane by Kate Dicamillo. Now, we talked last time about what these might be. They have little holes here, some do, or some have loops on the back. They're buttons. Why do you think they're buttons in a box of buttons? Let's find out. Bryce and Sarah Ruth had a father. Early the next morning, when the light was gray and uncertain, Sarah Ruth was sitting up in bed, coughing, and the father came home. He picked up Edward by one of his ears and said, "I ain't near." "It's a baby doll," said Bryce. "Don't look like no baby doll to me." Edward, hanging by one ear, was frightened. This, he was certain, was the man who crushed the heads of China dolls. Jangles, said Sarah Ruth between coughs. She held out her arms. "He's hers," said Bryce. "He belongs to her." The father dropped Edward on the bed, and Bryce picked up the rabbit and handed him to Sarah Ruth. "It don't matter anyway," said the father. "It don't make no difference. None of it." "It does so matter," said Bryce. "Don't you sass me," said the father, and he raised his hand and he slapped Bryce across the mouth. Then he turned and left the house. "You ain't got nothing to worry about," said Bryce to Edward. "He ain't nothing but a bully. Besides, he don't hardly ever come home." Fortunately, the father did not come back that day. Bryce went out to work, and Sarah Ruth spent the day in bed, holding Edward in her lap and playing with a box full of buttons. "Pretty," she said to Edward, as she lined the buttons up on her bed and arranged them in different patterns. It's very mathematical. Sometimes, when a coughing fit was particularly bad, she squeezed Edward so tight that he was afraid she would crack in two. Also, in between coughing fits, she took to sucking on one or the other of Edward's ears. And normally, Edward would have found intrusive, clingy behavior of this sort very annoying. But there was something about Sarah Ruth. He wanted to take care of her. He wanted to protect her. He wanted to do more for her. At the end of the day, Bryce returned with a biscuit for Sarah Ruth and a ball of twine for Edward. Sarah Ruth held the biscuit in both hands and took small, tentative bites. Those are like little not sure bites. "You eat all that up, honey. Let me hold Jangles," said Bryce. "Him and me got a surprise for you." Bryce took Edward off in a corner of the room, and with his pocket knife, he cut off links of twine and tied them to Edward's arms and feet, and then tied the twine to sticks of wood. What do you think he's doing? What's he making? "See, all day I've been thinking about it," Bryce said. "What we're going to do is make you dance. Sarah Ruth loves dancing. Mama used to hold her and dance around the room." "You eating that biscuit?" Bryce called to Sarah Ruth. "Uh-huh," said Sarah Ruth. "You hold on, honey. We got a surprise for you." Bryce stood up. "Close your eyes," he told her. He took Edward over to the bed and said, "Okay, you can open them now." Sarah Ruth opened her eyes. "Dance, Jangles," said Bryce, and then, moving the strings with sticks with his one hand, Bryce made Edward dance and drop and sway, and the whole while, at the same time, with his other hand, he held on to the harmonica and played a bright and lively tune. Sarah Ruth laughed. She laughed until she started to cough, and then Bryce laid Edward down and took Sarah Ruth in his lap and rocked her and rubbed her back. "You want some fresh air?" he asked her. "Let's get you out of this nasty old hair, huh?" Bryce carried his sister outside. He left Edward lying on the bed, and the rabbit, staring up at the smoke-stained ceiling, thought again about having wings. If he had them, he thought, he would fly high above the world to where the air was clear and sweet, and he would take Sarah Ruth with him. He would carry her in his arms. Surely, so high above the world, she'd be able to breathe without coughing. After a minute, Bryce came back inside, still carrying Sarah Ruth. "She wants you too," he said. "Jangles," said Sarah Ruth, and she held out her arms. So Bryce held Sarah Ruth, and Sarah Ruth held Edward, and the three of them stood outside. Bryce said, "You gotta look for falling stars. Them's is the ones with magic." They were quiet for a long time, all three of them looking up at the sky. Sarah Ruth stopped coughing. Edward thought that maybe she'd fallen asleep. "There," she said, and she pointed to a star streaking through the night sky. "Make a wish, honey," Bryce said, his voice high and tight. "That's your star. You make a wish for anything you want." And even though it was Sarah Ruth's star, Edward wished on it too. Chapter 19. Here's a picture of Edward on the floor. The string. Wonder when that is. The bed right there. Right, so let's see. Edward sure is feeling differently about people now, isn't he? Did he feel that way about Abilene, want to protect her and take her away from everything bad? Chapter 19. The days passed. The sun rose and set again and again. Sometimes the father came home, and sometimes he did not. Edward's ears became soggy, and he did not care. His sweater had almost completely unraveled, and it didn't bother him. He was hugged half to death, and it felt good. In the evenings, at the hands of Bryce, at the ends of twine, Edward danced and danced. 1 month passed, and then 2, and then 3. Sarah Ruth got worse. In the 5th month, she refused to eat. And in the 6th month, she began to cough up blood. Her breathing became ragged and uncertain, as if she were trying to remember in between breaths what to do, what breathing was. "Breathe, honey," Bryce stood over her and said. "Breathe," thought Edward from deep inside the well of her arms. "Please, please breathe." Bryce stopped leaving the house. He sat at home all day and held Sarah Ruth in his lap and rocked her back and forth and sang to her. On a bright morning in September, Sarah Ruth stopped breathing. "Oh no," said Bryce. "Oh honey, take a breath, please." Edward had fallen out of Sarah Ruth's arms the night before, and she'd not asked for him again. So, face down on the floor, arms over his head, Edward listened as Bryce wept. He listened as the father came home and shouted at Bryce. He listened as the father wept. "You can't cry," Bryce shouted. "You got no right to cry. You never even loved her. You don't know nothing about love." "I loved her," said the father. "I loved her." "I loved her too," thought Edward. "I loved her, and now she's gone. How could this be?" he wondered. How could he bear to live in a world without Sarah Ruth? The yelling between the father and son continued, and there was a terrible moment when the father insisted that Sarah Ruth belonged to him, and she was his girl, his baby, and that he was taking her to be buried. "She ain't yours!" Bryce screamed. "You can't take her! She ain't yours!" But the father was bigger and stronger, and he prevailed. He wrapped Sarah Ruth up in a blanket and carried her away. The small house became very quiet. Edward could hear Bryce moving around, muttering to himself. And then finally, the boy picked Edward up. "Come on, Jangles," Bryce said. "We're leaving. We're going to Memphis." Memphis? You know where Memphis is? Tennessee. We're in Tennessee right here. Not Memphis. We're way over on the other side of the state, but pretty cool. All right, guys. We'll see you next time. See what happens to Jangles and Bryce.